You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com. Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, Litecoin, and more. Cryptocurrencies and other digital assets are taking the financial world by storm. This exploding market provides everything a savvy trader needs: volatility, volume, and liquidity. Provided you know how to find it. That's where we come in. Welcome to the Crypto Rundown. Each week, we'll break down the latest trading activity, trends, and developments on everything from coins to tokens, futures, and even OTC options. If it's moving the crypto markets, then you'll find it on the Crypto Rundown. This program is brought to you by Genesis Volatility, also known as GVOL, home of institutional-grade crypto options analytics. Whether you're trading CFI options or DeFi options, cryptocurrencies move. Use GVOL Analytics to analyze implied volatility, model realized volatility, structure positions, and unlock alpha. For more information, visit gvol.io. That's GVOL.io. Now it's time to dive into the exploding world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time for the Crypto Rundown.
All right, everybody. That music means it is time once again for the Crypto Rundown, the program here on the Options Insider Radio Network, where we go above and beyond our traditional stomping grounds of your equity and your index and your VIX and everything else out there, your Teslas, your meme stock options, and look a little bit farther afield. See what's lighting up the tape over there in the world of crypto options. Going to talk the Bitcoin, the ETH, the volume, the volatility, the SKEW, all that fun stuff, and a whole bunch more. My name is Mark Longo from theoptionsinsider.com, as well as, of course, from the ever-exciting, at least we like to think so around these parts, Options Insider Radio Network, reminding you there are a legion, a plethora of ways for you folks to get the content. It's available on demand on just about every platform under the sun. Your Apple Podcast, your Google Podcast, your Spotify's, even YouTube, all these different platforms out there. Of course, if you want to go above and beyond, engage with the live, we have the Options Insider Plus. And indeed, if you want to get the exclusive content, we do the great Q&As, a great pro Q&A session coming up tomorrow with the chief strategist over there at IB, as well as our Options Oddities, which we do every week to break down the week's worth of unusual activity. Then the optionsinsider.com/pro is the place to go to learn more about that. And of course, however you listen live after the fact, make sure you hit us up. Questions, comments, insights, pearls of wisdom. We do love to hear from all of you guys and gals out there. Let's see who we're hearing from today. It is time to roll out the Crypto Hot Seat.
Forget about cold storage. It's time to turn up the heat on thought leaders from the world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time to take their place on the Crypto Hot Seat.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Crypto Hot Seat, the portion of the show where we roll out the old interview chair for folks from the world of crypto derivatives and indeed beyond to proceed to pick their brains for the benefit of you, the listener. And next up is a returning guest here on the hot seat, even though it has been some time. It's been almost 2 years. It's been since October of 2019. So it's been a little bit. We are joined today by JUTHICA CHOU, the head of OTC options trading over there at Kraken. JUTHICA, welcome back to the Crypto Rundown. It's been a while.
It has been. Thanks for having me back again.
And JUTHICA, obviously, it's been a while, almost 2 years. I think the last time you joined us, you were actually had a different title. You were over there at LedgerX. So catch us up. Obviously, a lot has happened in the crypto space over the past 2 years. Certainly a lot has happened from your perspective, including moving on over there to Kraken. So what prompted the switch? And then explain to our audience, what is the head of OTC options trading at Kraken? What do you do day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was indeed at LedgerX, I think the last time we spoke. And so just by way of background, I began my career as an options trader at Goldman. I traded equity and index options on the high frequency side, and then I built out our VIX business. And then I moved to the franchise and did some dispersion and correlation trading, so it was in the equity options space before starting LedgerX. Stayed in the options space with LedgerX, but completely new asset, obviously. The first U.S.-based derivatives exchange and clearinghouse for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Did that for a number of years, and then fairly recently got an opportunity that was born really out of client demand from our OTC desk at Kraken to build up and run crypto options trading here. So Kraken has an extensive OTC desk around the globe with people in everywhere: Sydney, Tokyo, New York, London, Sao Paulo. And one of the trends that had popped up and emerged recently was client demand for derivatives products, particularly volatility-based products. And so I came here to start that up from scratch. Now we've been operating, serving clients and really getting this up and running, but it was just born out of, I think, the volatility, the continued volume in the space, the larger market cap that can support a larger derivatives market, particularly for larger OTC clients. And that's what we're really working on here, is helping clients with solutions around volatility and options for Bitcoin and Ethereum.
I think a lot of our audience will be happy and indeed surprised maybe a little bit to hear that there is such robust demand for options over there at Kraken. You know, we last had the folks at Kraken on the show back, I do believe it was late March. We were trying to prod them to get more insight into options, but I'm glad we have you joining us on the show to give us just that now, JUTHICA. And it's interesting because, as you mentioned, there is this nascent client demand on the OTC side over at Kraken. So walk us through that a little bit. What kind of demand are you seeing? Is it folks just calling up and saying, hey, I want to buy a ton of upside calls in Bitcoin? Is it the opposite? Do I want to do a lot of covered call writing to generate income? What kind of demand are you seeing over there at Kraken?
Yeah, so definitely yield generation is one of the most popular plays that we see folks that are sitting on Bitcoin, Ethereum, that want to monetize the high implied volatility by selling call options against it. We've actually seen a good amount of put selling as well. So for folks that either want to dip their toes into getting exposure or start to accumulate a position, particularly if they have price targets in mind, selling puts and again capturing that volatility. So I think yield generation is one big facet of it. The other is that in general, what's fun about options, as you know well, is that you have this time dimension to them. And so when we saw, for example, the Ethereum upgrade in August, there were folks that were putting on positions around that as a catalyst, positioning around particular events that might be coming up or particular price targets into year end and things like that. So a directional aspect. And then the last is just the natural leverage that options provide. I think our OTC client base and a lot of the clients that we deal with, they don't necessarily want like 100 to 1 leverage, but they might want to allocate their positions into a derivative that requires a little bit less funding upfront. So, lay out a couple grand for an upside call position, be exposed and not miss out on a rally to the upside, but be able to preserve some capital as opposed to if they had put it on in a spot position. So it's kind of a wide range of both directional and hedging bets, but I think the popularity is really driven by this sustained high volatility asset that we have. Very high market cap, high volatility, and even though volatility sometimes feels a little bit lower when we sit in the mid 80s, having been in the hundreds earlier this year, this is still quite a tremendously volatile asset. And I think that lends itself to opportunity as well as the yield generating strategies.
Yield generation, that definitely does coincide with what we're hearing from a lot of the other options and derivatives platforms out there that people are here to sell covered calls first and foremost, and then everything else kind of follows a different second. But obviously it also is driven by what swings we're seeing out there. In the underlying, we certainly have seen some swings of late. I'm certain, JUTHICA, maybe last week around this time, your desk was lighting up with a few downside put-buy type orders.
Well, I think in general, last week, the initial leg down was actually kind of quiet. It was the second leg. So initially when we kind of came down from 47K, a few K down, I think some folks were actually expecting a little bit of a bounce, and because we've gotten bounces the last couple of times, and maybe it was liquidation driven, so those typically mean reverting. But it was the second leg down that we really saw a little more in uptake in volatility. Where we're seeing folks put on hedges is more towards the end of the year, so like December timeframe, not necessarily the near term. That just tends to be, I think, the right sweet spot between capturing what folks might be worried about in terms of moves to the downside, but also not going further out than December, where the premiums do get kind of high because it is such a high volatile asset. But that said, since then, vol's actually reverted a little bit and come back in a little bit. But, we're still talking mid-80 vol, so nothing too low.
Speaking of volatility, I know you were pretty active in your previous gig over there at LedgerX. In the Bitcoin volatility space, you had some offerings on that front, and one of the first real Bitcoin VIX type offerings out there. Is that something you plan to restart over there at Kraken? Should we be looking forward to some sort of Kraken Bitcoin vol index in the near future?
I don't think for anything tradable per se. I think in terms of where vols are trading and historical volatility and reference rates, our clients definitely look to us for that kind of information, which we're happy to provide and working on better reference levels for those purposes. But as far as a tradable asset, I still think it's a little bit early. We kind of need the vanilla options to just be a little more liquid, a little bit larger of a market. And then when the time is right, I would imagine that more like tradable VIX type markets would pop up.
And obviously, I'd imagine the big dog is still Bitcoin, which, as you mentioned, options on it, Bitcoin is still driving most of the activity there. But ETH is also pretty popular. Getting calls on the OTC desk for ETH options trading as well?
Definitely. And the wide range, from some yield generating, but definitely speculation from folks who wanted to get some exposure, like prior to the upgrade that I mentioned, from people kind of trading, when people trade inflows and outflows between Bitcoin and ETH, using options to do that in ways that are sometimes more capital efficient. And the desk overall, the OTC desk overall, has seen a huge pickup in other tokens and assets trading this year. I think if you look at the OTC desk, Bitcoin is now maybe 30% of OTC volume compared to 70 to 80% a couple of years ago. And I think we're seeing that trend manifest itself in Bitcoin and ETH options trading as well.
Interesting. That's a much lower percentage than I would have assumed out there. Now, obviously, you have a background over there at LedgerX and now coming to Kraken doing a lot of action in the OTC space in a variety of products. Can we expect maybe down the road Kraken to join the fray on the listed options side, competing with the CMEs and the LedgerXs to have some of their own Kraken listed options products that we can look forward to? Or is the regulatory environment still a little bit too, shall we say, fluid for that sort of thing?
I can't really comment on Kraken exchanges plans. I know that we do have a derivatives exchange, obviously, out of the UK, the crypto facilities, which currently list futures. We don't have options listed. But I think for now, what we're finding is we're able to serve the client demand best and through OTC options. And I think we'll continue to see how this goes and then evaluate. But personally, for me, being on the trading side is definitely my focus and the area that I'm excited about working on.
You mentioned Bitcoin, you mentioned ETH, but I know since you're OTC, you're not really limited. You can put up options trades and pretty much whatever the customers want. Outside of the big two, are there any surprising products that you guys have received orders for out there that made you scratch your chin and say, I didn't expect that?
Nothing particularly surprising. I think it probably mimics what you would see in the tokens in general, where in any given day or week, there's some that are particularly top of mind and well hyped, and then sometimes they fade into new one next week. And so we see those resemble in the inquiries that we get. But I would say generally it is still more Bitcoin and Ethereum that on the option side, that's the focus. And I think that's just because the options market in general, looking at exchanges and overall liquidity, is a little more focused on those two.
Well, JUTHICA, I'm glad we can get you on to give us a little bit of an update here on what's going on from the OTC options perspective over there at Kraken. But before we go, we always want to leave our audience wanting more. So if you have any hints, any teases of what people can look forward to coming down the pike over there from Kraken, now is the time, madam. The floor is yours.
I don't have any, but if you want to trade OTC options, you know where to find me, and I'm also on Twitter. So come reach out to me and we'll get you set up.
There you go. So check them out over there at Kraken. You know where to find them. Don't need me to tell you where to go to learn more about Kraken. And then you could reach out to JUTHICA and the rest of the team over there on the OTC options side. It's always fun to talk options trading here in the U.S., even if it is, I should say, OTC. But now we have to keep on rolling. Let's break down some of that options activity in a little bit more detail. It is time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
It's time to explore the latest trending activity, trends, and developments across the world's leading crypto market. It's time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Bitcoin Breakdown, the portion of the show where we do exactly that. We break down the week that was, and indeed still is, from a Bitcoin trading and trending, volatility, SKEW, OI, all that fun stuff, and a whole bunch more. And, you know, we're seeing Bitcoin still taking a wee bit of a break from where it was this time last week. Remember, last week we were, of course, in the teeth of an aggressive sell-off. We were at the 43,600 level. We had sold off nearly 10% already by that point on the show. Coming into today's show, we are still below that level, flirting with the 43,000 level, 43,023 to be precise. Of course, we had quite the range since then. Got up to about 45,000 on the upside, 45,100 or so to be precise. That was on Friday. And then, of course, we broke through the 40K level ever so briefly on Tuesday last week. 39.6 or so was the low. And that's the second leg of the sell-off that JUTHICA was referring to on the show here. In terms of vol, I remember last time we were talking about how there was just a big vol spike going on in the middle of the show. And that's what to be expected when you see an aggressive sell-off out there in a product like Bitcoin. You know, people ask us all the time, is this a correlated asset? If so, what is it correlated to? Is it uncorrelated? Days like last Monday show that when it hits the fan, the old adage, correlation goes to one, tends to apply to Bitcoin as well, because it was selling off even more than the major indices out there. We saw the S&P off somewhere in the range of 2 to 3% for most of the day, whereas Bitcoin was off nearly 10% for much of the day, and ETH similar levels out there. So interesting stuff. Of course, we saw a commensurate vol spike with that on the show when the day kicked off. Coming into that show, really, Sunday night, the vol was around a 79. Of course, once the sell-off got into high gear, it kicked up to about 88%. We saw the vol continue to kick up, again, as JUTHICA mentioned, that second leg, the continued wave of sell-off into Tuesday and even Wednesday. We saw the vol on Bitcoin actually top out on Wednesday, almost a 97%, about a 96.8 out there. And then, of course, as I've said many times, Bitcoin vol doesn't want to hang out those high levels for very long, and it didn't over this past week as well. Coming into today's show now, it is back down to pretty much exactly where we started, 79%, before all that big sell-off popped off. So I've said it before, I will say it again, Bitcoin vol acting a lot like precious metals vol, in which it can get a lift, it can get a spike, but it's short-lived, and then it reverts right back down to where it was trading. And so far, we haven't seen a lot of breaking of that pattern throughout this year, and this past week, no exception. BitVol, the Bitcoin VIX that Simon and his team over there at T3 are working on, actually one of the products that LedgerX is licensing and actually putting up and trading over there these days. JUTHICA's former home over there. And they were at about a 91.5 on our last show, and this show about an 89%. Remember, that's a bit of a different type of indicator, though. That's more of a 30-day kind of rolling indicator. So it's not going to be as susceptible to some of the shocks as when we're talking about the hourly vol out there in Bitcoin. Let's talk about the SKEW. Obviously, we had big swings out there as well. On our last show, the SKEW swung from about almost -2, about -1.7 on Sunday night. By the time we kicked off the show on Monday, the SKEW had swung to a -7. Obviously, folks were looking at very downside and directional oriented trades. It got as low as -8 during Monday's session. So Monday was the peak for a negative SKEW, unlike Wednesday, which was the peak of the vol. And then it slowly drifted back. Coming into today's show, we're at about a negative 1.5. So once again, pretty much right back to where we started right before showtime last week. One area that isn't back to where it started, though, is the open interest. Remember, I said September had a lot of OI and it was about to roll off the board. Well, it did roll off the board, and it took a lot of contracts with it. When we were lining up the months last week, September had about 65,000 contracts. So then that changed a little bit less because we've seen some other opening paper to offset it. But overall, OI still down pretty aggressively with September going off the board here. Open interest now in Bitcoin. This is on Deribit. By the way, all these analytics coming at you courtesy of our friends over there at Genesis Volatility. gvol.io is the place to go to kick the tires and light the fires out there. You can check all these data points and a whole bunch more over there at Genesis Volatility. If you did so, if you went on over to the open interest tab, you would see that the open interest right now in Bitcoin is at about 89,000 open on the call front. That's down 31,000 from this time last week. And the puts are at about 48,000. That's down 13,000 from this time last week. You're talking about 44,000 decrease from this time last week. That's a lot of contracts to go the way of the dodo, listeners. But of course, if Bitcoin keeps moving around a bit out there, and as JUTHICA mentioned, if these vol levels stay relatively high, at least compared to broad equity, for example, that should make up for it sometime in the near future here. In terms of where you folks are lining up, remember, September was number one on the board last week with 65,000 contracts. That has now gone the way of the dodo. So the new big dog is December with 59,000. It's up about 4,000 from this time last week. Not a huge change out there. Number two is October with about 25,000. It's up about 3,300 from this time last week. And then things are so low out there. The number three, in terms of where you folks are lining up from an expiration perspective, is actually the weekly expiring on October 1st. That has 15,000 contracts open. Obviously, the monthlies will grow and usurp all of that, but that's kind of where we find ourselves now with September, the big dog, rolling off the board. Of course, when you talk the notional value of the open interest, obviously, that's coming in as well. On our last show, it was about $8 billion worth of notional value open on Deribit and about $9 billion total. You added up all the other venues out there, CME and LedgerX and everything else. Now it's about $6 billion with September going the way of the dodo. And you add in everything else, it's about $6.5 billion out there. So again, OI taking a big hit with September. Volume-wise, though, we actually had a pretty active week. And again, that shouldn't be too surprising given what I just laid out from a volatility and a SKEW and many other perspectives over the course of last week. We had multiple days that threatened to break that 1 billion notional volume level out there, including, let's see, the busiest day was actually last Monday, our show day, with almost 1 billion, 965 million worth of notional volume. Last Friday was a number two with about 950 million worth of notional volume. So you had multiple days threatening the 1B level. Didn't quite get there, but almost hit it a couple of times. So that's enough for a decently active week. Again, you got to go all the way back to a month ago, August 20th, for our last official 1 billion day. And then before that, you have to go all the way back to the April-May timeframe to really find the 1B level again. So it's been a while since we've had a decent volume week. And this past week actually turned the knob not quite up to 11, but it got up to about, let's say, a 9.5 or so, somewhere in that range. In terms of where you folks are lining up, what are the hot strikes out there right now? Remember, the 100,000 strike has been the king of the roost for a while in Bitcoin options. That remains the case, even if it is a somewhat smaller king this week, maybe more of a duke or a baron. It's about 10.2 thousand contracts, so 10,200 contracts open on that strike. That's down about 2,300 from this time last week. So obviously there were quite a few contracts that were ready to expire at the end of September. So view that how you will. A little bit optimistic, probably the other leg of some verticals out there. Let's hope those weren't folks just open buying the par strike, because it's a pretty long way for Bitcoin to go in a short amount of time. Number two size position out there is the 80,000 strike with about 6,600 contracts. That's down about 1,700 from this time last week. Number three, the 60K strike, 6,400. That's down about 2,000 from last week. So pretty much all of these are getting clipped pretty aggressively. Number four, the 50K strike, down about, that has about 6,400 contracts open as well. That's pretty close. There's a lot of a dead heat in the middle there of our top five. That's down about 2,000 as well from last week. And a newcomer to our top five, it was actually number 6, I think, not too long ago, but now it's actually in the top 5. It's the 200,000 strike. So yeah, if the par strike, the 100,000 strike, is not optimistic, not outlandish enough for your blood, pick your adjective of choice. Then the 200,000 strike will have to suffice. It's good enough for 6,200 contracts out there right now. So it isn't that far behind the 50,000 strike, the 60,000 strike, or the 80,000 strike. That is an interesting one. We'll see how long it hangs out in the top 5. What are your thoughts? 200,000 in Bitcoin? When? End of the year, end of next year? When is your time frame for if you had to make such a trade? Hopefully it's folks, at the very least, maybe using that as a second leg of a vertical as well. It'd be interesting if someone had the 100,000, 200,000 vertical. But nothing surprises me in the world of Bitcoin options anymore. Let's head on out to the CME landscape, see if they put up any paper over the past week. And actually, a pretty decent week for CME Bitcoin futures and options. Seems like someone turned the spigot back on out there after they were kind of languishing for a while. The futures were having a hard time getting over 5,000 or 6,000 contracts. The options were doing a handful of contracts. The barometer we use for the options is we like to see maybe at least 100 contracts a day, and we have been seeing that a lot last week, multiple days, over 100 contracts, which again, doesn't sound like a lot, but for this product, it's actually a ton. There were 3 days last week, over 100 contracts. The busiest day was last Friday. Nearly 200 contracts, 177 contracts on the tape for the options. I'll have to go back and check to see if that is the busiest day they've had. But if not, it's definitely up there. And they had, again, 3 days, over 100 contracts. The OI also ticking up to about 1,550. So that's up about 300 contracts from this time last week. Again, doesn't sound like a ton, but that's a beefy, huge contract. So someone turning on the spigot out there. You saw the same type of activity with the options. Last Friday was a busy day for the futures and the options over there at CME, with about 14,000 contracts going up on Friday. Again, that's a far cry from some of the levels we were seeing not too long ago, 25 up to around 30,000 sometime on the CME futures. But still, 14,000 compared to what we've seen lately, struggling to make 5,000. That's a pretty decent jump. The rest of the week was around 13,000 or less. So the OI is also up pretty firmly, up to about nearly 9,000 on the futures, up about 1,600 from our last show. So again, seems like someone turned the futures and the options back on over there at CME this past week. Seemed like the second leg of the week, kind of after the initial sell-off, is where we saw a lot of the volume coming in at CME, which is surprising. I would have thought it would be the opposite. I would have thought in the teeth of the sell-off on Monday and maybe into Tuesday, we would have seen the biggest days, but actually it was Friday. In terms of the micros, where most of you are probably going to come to play, they hit 40,000 contracts on Friday. That's a pretty good day. Rest of the week, somewhere around 17,000 or so, which are kind of the levels we've been accustomed to seeing out there. The OI also up to about 40,000, up about 18,000 over the past few weeks. So we've seen a nice pop in OI, nice pop in volume over there in the micros. And that's good for everyone, because the more volume they do, that means you might see the micro options listed soon. And that is, I think, where a lot of you will want to sink your teeth there on the CME options front. Meanwhile, I know a lot of you like to sink your teeth into the altcoin. So let's get to that next.
It's time to move beyond Bitcoin and find out what's moving the rest of the crypto marketplace. It's time to boldly venture into the altcoin universe.
All right, everybody, welcome to the altcoin universe, the portion of the show where we break down everything outside of the big dog, except right now when we do the top 10 out there. Remember, take these overall market caps with a bit of a tasty grain of salt. Number 10, the old doggy coin, that has about, 26.5 billion worth of market cap. Number 9, it's Polkadot at 27.6. Number 8, good old USD coin at about 31 billion. Number 7, Solana. Got a feeling we'll be coming back to them maybe a little bit later. 42, almost 42.5 billion. Number 6, it's XRP down to about 43.6 billion. Number 5, it's Binance Coin, about 57 billion. Number 4, Tether, 68.5 billion. Numero Trace, it's Cardano at about 69.5 billion. Number 2, it's ETH, 352, almost 353 billion. And the big dog out there, Bitcoin, right around 810 billion on the market cap front. Let's roll on out now to the number 2 in terms of market cap out there. It's ETH. And again, we're hovering shy of the 3,000 level yet again, 2996.5. Coming into showtime. For frame of reference, we were around 3,050 on our last show. So we're off a little over 58 handles from where we were this time last week. We had a high of not quite 3,200, about 3,175. That was back on Thursday. And of course, we got a lot lower, down to about 2,654 back on Tuesday of last week. So ETH had quite the interesting range of late. Of course, all this movement in the underlying generated some volatility until it didn't, at least. Of course, on our last show, as I mentioned, we were in the middle of a vol spike in ETH as well, not just in Bitcoin. And that vol spike carried us from about 89% on Sunday night heading into the show to about 103 onto triple digits by the time we started the show on Monday. That vol spike continued. It got up to about 113% on Wednesday. So we saw interesting vol follow through in both Bitcoin and ETH going into about Wednesday. The vol right now at about a 95%. So it has come off, but not quite to the level where we started going into the show on last Monday. So not quite a full retreat like we saw in Bitcoin, but still a bit of a reversion. It takes a lot to maintain a vol of 113% for any sustained length of time, unless you're a meme stock these days, then they could do it in their sleep. In terms of SKEW, similar deal to what we saw in Bitcoin out there on our last show. On the Sunday night, the SKEW was about +1. Once the sell-off started on Monday, it swung to almost a -5, about a -4.6. And then it kept getting worse. And that extended into Wednesday as well. It hit about a -11.5, almost a -12 on Wednesday morning before finally bouncing back. And now coming into today's show, we're at about a -2.25. So most of the extreme downside of this, at least from a SKEW perspective, has mitigated since our last show. ETH OI, same deal as Bitcoin. In fact, ETH, if anything, is even more quarterly centric than Bitcoin is. So when a quarterly like September rolls off the board, it takes a lot of paper with it. There were a metric ton of contracts in September. In fact, there were a little over 400,000 open when we talked about it on the show last week. All of that has now gone the way of the dodo. Let's check in on the overall numbers out here right now. Coming into showtime on Deribit, we have about 788,000 calls open right now. That's down about 166,000 from our show last week. The puts are down to 342,000. It's down about 122,000 from last week. So that's a big change, even if it isn't the entirety of September that went away, which is around 400,000. Obviously, some more reopening of positions has happened since September has rolled off the board. In terms of the notional value of that OI, obviously it has gone down quite a bit. We were around $5 billion on our last show. Now it's about $3 billion, with September going the way of the dodo. If you're wondering what is the number 2 venue out there in terms of ETH options, obviously Deribit is pretty much all of the oxygen in the room. But outside of that, you have OKEX with around 86 million worth of notional OI on their platform. So a very, very distant number 2, but still floating around out there. In terms of volume, speaking of floating around, we were floating around some decent numbers over the course of the past week. Deribit flirting ever so close with the $500 million. I think we hit like 480 and 490 on Monday, then again on Wednesday out there. Actually, Monday and Friday were the 2 hot days out there. So not quite hitting the $500 million level, but pretty close, which again, for a product that hasn't been doing a heck of a lot of paper, which has struggled some weeks to even do 150 million worth of notional volume out there. $500 million, that's a decent level. Again, you got to go back a ways to find the last 1B day. That was actually back on May 12th on the show. So you got to go a little bit back into the history of this year to find it. But outside of that, this is a pretty active week. And the fact that they hit it multiple days shows that there was some sustained activity out there. Again, looking at where you folks are lining up from an expiration perspective, September gone the way of the dodo. So now DECE is the big dog with 487,000 contracts. That's up about 34,000 from this time last week. Followed by number 2, March at 168,000. That's up about 13,000. And then once again, the weekly expiring on October 1st, number 3 with 110,000. That won't stay that way for very long, though, listeners. In terms of where you folks are lining up from a strike perspective, let's see what's going on out there. Obviously, most of these numbers are going to be down dramatically from this time last week. Let's see which ones got hurt the most. The number 1 size position out there in ETH right now is still the 5,000 strike with about 81,000 contracts, even though about 18,000 of those came off the board over this past week. Followed by number 2, the 10K strike with about 53,000 contracts, down appropriately enough, 10K from this time last week. So a lot of upside going the way of the dodo in September. Number 3, the 4,000 strike. That's got about 48,000 contracts open. That's down about 7,300. So a big drubbing there as well. Number 4, the 8,000 strike has about 43,000 contracts open. That's actually a newcomer to our top 5, so we'll keep an eye on that one. And number 5 is the 7,000 strike with about 40,000 contracts exactly open on the strike. That's down about 13,000 from this time last week. So the big loser in terms of OI going the way of the dodo was the 5K strike, with nearly 20,000 contracts going away in September. We'll see if that remains the case as we keep on rolling out here. In terms of the futures at CME, the E futures, putting up some decent numbers over the past week as well. The big day out there for them was actually on Friday with nearly 10,000 contracts on the tape. Again, that's a pretty sizable product. So that's decent paper out there. The OI also ticking up, if ever so slightly, up to about 4,400 contracts from where it was this time last week. Let's peek at a few others before we answer some of your questions here. Good old Ripple actually gaining about 0.9 of a cent, so not even a full penny over the course of the past week. So kind of a lot of nothing for Ripple on the show this week. We were at about 92.5 cents last week and about 93.3 cents this week. In terms of Bitcoin Cash, down about 48 handles from last week, and Bitcoin SV down 11, and the old Dogecoin pretty much unched from this time last week. And let's keep on rolling into your crypto questions.
You've got questions about crypto. Who doesn't? It's time to find out the answers to your crypto questions.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Crypto Questions, the portion of the show where you folks take the reins with your questions, your comments, your insights, pearls of wisdom. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the top 10, I might come back to Solana. We have a question here from Makash. He says, hey, Mark, it's not really an options topic, and he puts in parentheses, yet. He says, but what are your thoughts on the massive run for Solana lately? Maybe this will be one of your go-tos on the show going forward. And yes, we have been aware of this. We have been watching this. Obviously, Solana has kind of been a fixture in our top 10 for the better part of the last 6 months or so. If you're not familiar with Solana, listeners, this is a relatively recent addition to the Pantheon out here. It launched back in April or so of last year, but it's really this year where it's kind of kicked it in to high gear from a price perspective. January was trading right around $1, I think about $1.50 or so, and it got up to north of $200 in early September. Had an enormous run over the course of this past year. At the time, it had a market cap of somewhere around 60 billion. That has come off a little bit now. Let's see, where were we when we just checked in it? Where was that market cap there for the top 10? Solana was, of course, at number 7. The market cap is now down to about 42 billion. Still well north of where it was at the start of the year. Coming into Showtime was at about a 142.5. So quite the run from the $1.50 it was at the start of this year. What is this thing? Well, it's a bit of an ETH competitor, to put it very reductively at the end of the day. It's effectively one of these blockchain platforms for decentralized apps. You might say that sounds a lot like ETH, and it's because it kind of is. Obviously, the Solana diehards will go out there and try to argue a lot of different benefits out there for Solana versus ETH. Some people, they think it's faster out there, lower fees. So a lot of interesting benefits on that front. Of course, that gets into the proof of stake versus proof of work debate as well, and how a lot of these cryptocurrencies use a lot more power than they really should per transaction. So Solana is a little bit of an improvement on that front as well. So all these things have driven it to be a very exciting product. Whether it merits the 60-odd billion worth of market cap, that's a difficult question to answer. Obviously, a lot of this was caught up in kind of this very recent frenzy of this. Everyone looking for maybe an alternative to ETH out there for a variety of reasons, and Solana fits very neatly into that bucket. As to your question as to will this be one of our go-tos, I think we will start working this into the rotation going forward. Obviously, it's not really a big options story yet, but I'm sure, in fact, I asked JUTHICA about this at the top of the show. She never mentioned Solana coming on their radar from an OTC perspective. So it sounds like the OTC options volume over there at Kraken, still predominantly Bitcoin and a smattering of ETH out there. But when that starts to change, when we start to see maybe some of the OTC desks first starting to inquire about Solana options, and certainly at a $142 price level, yeah, at that price level, it certainly would make for an interesting optionable product. We just need to drive some more demand on that front. And when we start seeing that trickle into the OTC desks first, then maybe that will materialize, and maybe we'll start seeing some paper going up over there on places like Deribit for Solana options. Again, look at the numbers we just broke down for Bitcoin and then for ETH. It's got a ways to go before we can even catch up to something like ETH. But it's certainly, from a price action perspective, one we are going to keep on our radar, and then maybe hopefully it'll translate into some options volume going forward. And then you, Mukesh, and everyone else who's kind of asking about Solana, all you diehard and all you adherents out there, we'll have a lot more to talk about on the show because, yeah, we'd love to have more to talk about than just Bitcoin and ETH. It's just those are still kind of all the oxygen in the room from a crypto derivatives perspective. But we keep an eye on all these other ones too. Don't worry. Even if they don't make it on the show every week, we are watching them and we are waiting until we have the moment when we could pounce and feature them on the show in a much more dramatic and interesting fashion. Great question, Mukesh. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for the crypto rundown this week. I want to thank our guest, JUTHICA CHOU from Kraken. You don't need me to tell you where to go to learn about Kraken. They're pretty easy to find on the web, on Twitter, and everything else. Interesting to know that they have this new OTC options arm that bodes for maybe some more options products, options volume going forward at Kraken, which, of course, we here on the show love to see. Remember, we have the great Pro Q&A coming up for all of our Secret Club members tomorrow with the chief strategist over there at Interactive Broker, so stay tuned for that. And then, of course, throughout the rest of the week, we have Education Wednesday coming up, the double dose of Options Bootcamp and Options Playbook Radio. For a lot of listeners of this show, those two shows are definitely must listens. If you're confused by any of these terms, the volume, the SKEW, the open interest, the volatility, all these things that we throw around on the show on a regular basis, those shows will take you from A to Z and really explain all these different options concepts in a lot more detail. So if you're new to the world of options, those are great starting points, Options Bootcamp and Options Playbook Radio. Then fast forward to next Monday. We'll see you right back here, another episode of the Crypto Rundown.
This program is brought to you by Genesis Volatility, also known as GVol, home of institutional-grade crypto options analytics. Whether you're trading CeFi options or DeFi options, cryptocurrencies move. Use GVol Analytics to analyze implied volatility, model realized volatility, structure positions, and unlock alpha. For more information, visit gvol.io. That's GVOL.io. You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.